Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to People and Culture in a Post-COVID Workplace, brought to you by Domain Computer Services. I'm Vinny Civitello, Communications Manager for the New Jersey Business and Industry Association, and with us today are Michaela Campbell-Robinson, Nancy Noto, Philomena Lepore Taylor, and Rosanna Fox. A few housekeeping matters before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to you tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. I'd also like to draw your attention to the questions button. Looks like a question mark with a speech bubble around it. Our speakers would be happy to take your questions, so get them in as they come to you. One last thing, if you encounter any audio-visual issues while you're watching this webinar, you can try refreshing your browser, but if that doesn't work, don't forget you will be getting that recording. So if you have to sign out and watch that, you won't miss a thing. So now let's get things started.
Great, thank you so much, Vinny, and thank you to NJBIA for allowing us to have this webinar and talk about such an important topic. My name is Philomena Lepore Taylor, as Vinny just said, and I am a partner at Lepore Taylor Fox, which is an immigration law firm based in Paramus, New Jersey. I am so thrilled to be talking today about the topic of reopening. I think that everyone has reopening on their minds in one way or another, and a lot of people have very mixed feelings about it, I'm sure. But we're going to couch this in a positive way. It is a positive thing. It's a positive change. And a lot of our inboxes are, bouncing with reopening webinars, reopening topics, which a lot of that is centering around health and safety protocols and PPP loans. But today we thought we would talk about a little bit of a different topic, and that is the human resources aspect of reopening. I recently listened to a TED Talk by the CEO and founder of PayPal. And as you might imagine, PayPal right now is booming. Their business is booming. Paperless payments is something that people are really seeking out right now. And so, but I do think that he really honed in on this moment in time quite eloquently, and the way that he couched it was that we're in the midst of three crises. We're in the midst of a health crisis, we're in the midst of an economic crisis, and finally we're in the midst of a psychological crisis. As we all start to reopen, employers are dealing with a workforce that isn't just going to wake up and come back to work as though nothing has been happening. Right? We've all been deeply impacted by COVID-19 and by this time in history. So, how can we as employers be sensitive to that is what we really want to talk about today. And how can we draw upon these great challenges in terms of, people who are scared, people who are frustrated, people who are questioning their place in the world. They're questioning what kind of work they want to do. They're questioning their families, their relationships, society. How can we as employers address the needs of those people and really use this as an opportunity to put people first and reinvent our businesses in a way that, creates something new, creates a workplace that fosters the specific needs of the people who make our companies so great. And so I think, without belaboring this, I really want to get into the panelists. We have an excellent group of speakers today. We have Nancy Noto, who is the founder of NPN HR Consulting. Nancy is an expert in organizational psychology and HR, especially for new and growth stage businesses. So even if you're not a new business, as a result of COVID-19, you're probably facing a lot of new issues. And, we're all sort of at this moment where we can reinvent ourselves to a certain extent. So I think Nancy's going to bring a lot of creativity into the discussion today about staffing models and how to plan for the future in light of what's been happening. We also have Rosanna Fox. She is my one and only business partner at Lepore Taylor Fox. She is a seasoned immigration lawyer. She heads the firm's entrepreneur and startup practice, And she's also going to be talking about how employers can think about leveraging foreign workers as part of their staffing models. And last but certainly not least, Michaela Campbell Robinson, who is of counsel with the law firm of Greenberg Traurig in New Jersey, will be speaking. Michaela is an employment law and litigation attorney, and she will be talking about how to attract and retain diverse talent and really speaking to the issue of corporate core values of diversity and inclusion. So I'm so excited to hear what our panelists have to say. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Nancy.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. As I was introduced, my name is Nancy Noto, and I'm an HR consultant. I work primarily with startups and growth stage businesses, but I've also been working with smaller businesses and now also businesses of all sizes, regardless of being a startup or not. So it's been a unique time for everybody. So as we're thinking about returning to work and engaging our employees and inspiring them to come back to us, one of the first things I keep talking with my clients about is, what are your core values? So starting with that question, if your organization hasn't defined their core values or your core values yet, it's a good time to put the brakes on a little bit and remember that our business and our organization can be driven by values. And I think particularly right now, people are making employment decisions for themselves based on their personal values. And I'm seeing that a lot where people are leaving organizations if it's no longer aligning with their beliefs and vice versa. And there's a lot of that happening. So knowing what your company stands for from a values perspective, I think is really important right now. And if anyone's unfamiliar with the term core values or what that means, they're basically fundamental beliefs of a person or an organization. And these guiding principles basically can help dictate behavior and can help people at your company understand right from wrong, particularly in these very politicized and sometimes polarizing world that we're living in. So the values, just defining them and sharing them with your employees really helps companies to determine if they're on the right path and, fulfilling their goals by creating, this unwavering guide that you guys can stand by what we believe in. And so in some examples of core values to share, there are organizations that environmental sustainability is a huge part of their, core value set, right? So everything in their efforts revolve around that or drive, or that's part of their decision making. Learning, teaching, and growing, right? That can be another example of a core value where education internally as well as externally is a huge part of what drives that company. Giving back to local communities is another one. Families come first, right? Like that can be a core value of your organization. Work-life balance. All of those things can really, help keep people on track and also help retain the employees that are, particularly personally aligned with those values already. And then as we return to work, some of the challenges that I've been hearing is actually getting people back into their offices or into their workplaces, right? Because right now, if they're on furlough or if they're on unemployment, it's working pretty well right now. People are not making, they're making a decent wage based on unemployment right now. So what is it's taking a risk to come back into a workplace right now. They're putting their bodies at risk and their families at risk. So what's the incentive from the organization? You might have to start thinking about, we have to give them more than just the job because that's no longer, enough right now. So you have to think about what incentives are going to really bring people back into your organization and excited to be there. A few examples of incentives that you can think about is, again, reinforming, bringing your values back to the forefront, that your family is important to us, your health is important to us. Here's how we're showing you that by providing the correct, medical, safety pieces and, being accommodating to your schedule needs, things like that can really go a long way right now. Another great option is actually if you offer a health plan to your employees, check and see if it offers an EAP. It's called an Employee Assistance Program. A lot of health plans include that, and they're that like widely underutilized by organizations. And if you don't have one, look into adding one. It's a great resource for employees where they can have access to mental health services. They can have access to, finding the appropriate childcare. If they're having issues with bill pay, like paying their own personal bills, they actually get a resource through the EAP to help them through some of these challenges. And it can be a really meaningful addition to a benefits plan that isn't as expensive as just a regular benefit. It's not a huge cost to the organization. It's incremental. So I definitely recommend looking into things like that.
What that's called? Would you mind repeating what that's called if anyone wants to write that
Sure.
down?
Yeah, an EAP, which stands for Employee Assistance Program.
Great. I think that's really useful information. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great. So that's just one example of the types of benefits that you might want to be offering, both driven by your core values and also the world we're in. People are needing more support than they currently have, and maybe more than your HR department or you as a leader should provide to them. You want to be able to give them an outside resource to utilize.
And Nancy,
think,
can I chime in with a question? So what about smaller employers? I would imagine that they might feel slightly disadvantaged in terms of their ability to incentivize workers. Do you think that some of these concepts would still apply to a smaller employer?
I do, yeah. I think that you're going to have to reevaluate your staffing models for sure. And I think you might have to have people working less hours, or you might have to have fewer people working more hours. And I think with that comes the need to move budget around. That might mean taking budget away from a payroll item, right? If you're going to have to understaff, well, then use that extra savings, at least part of it, to make it better for the people who are staying. So while, if you have 3 people working for you, cutting one of them is a huge change. But if you have to do that, yes, it'll save your organization that person's salary. Use some of that savings to give to the people who are staying in some way or another. I think that's, don't forget about incentivizing those that stay. It might mean you have to save it more money though in other places, which can certainly be a challenge.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that in your experience, you're seeing clients express that personal beliefs are driving their decisions as to where to work, where to stay, whether to go back to work. Like personal beliefs are informing. So are there any tools that employers can use to help them gauge their staff's personal beliefs at this moment in time?
Absolutely. And I think the key is allowing them to tell you what they feel comfortable telling you. No one is like, you don't have to interview someone and say, what are your values and beliefs? Like that wouldn't be appropriate. But I'm recommending anonymous surveys right now for sure. I think sending out an anonymous survey where you're asking people, how do they feel about returning to work? Have they, resolved, like, do they take public transportation? And is that going to be a problem returning to work? Do they have childcare? Is that going to be a problem returning to work? So, and then asking about, you can ask questions about what they value in relation to the organization, and also using that opportunity to re-engage with the values of your organization and understanding how people feel about them based on this survey.
I think that's a great idea. And do companies, have a practice, or should they have a practice of publicizing their core values and making them known, publicly, internally? How can they go about doing that?
Yeah, lots of companies do that. I think if you were to go onto like Apple's website, for example, and search core values, you'd find their organizational core values. A lot of times they're part of an organization's marketing material. It's how they're speaking to their customers and their clients, depending upon the type of business. So while I think some people might not want to share their core values with their public, I guess, if they're very extreme or very polarizing in some way, I would find it hard to believe that in the work context, it's probably a general value that people can get behind. But I think that can become a part of the way your employees are interacting with your customers, right? So if one of your core values is around high level customer service and, making people feel heard, let's say, you want to make sure that your employees are behaving in a way with customers that are part of your core values.
Okay. Well, I think this is all really helpful, as we start to open and how to really sort of, I think, take note of the fact that there are people who are not going to be 100% comfortable coming back. Maybe they're collecting unemployment. Like you said, maybe that's good enough income for now. And so really, how do we incentivize folks to want to come back and work and excite them? Obviously, a lot of safety protocols, I'm sure, would be, important there. But again, it's this cultural aspect that you're touching upon that I think adds the extra level that might, change someone's mind from no to yes.
Yeah.
So in terms of staffing models, you did mention, Nancy, that employers are, going to be thinking about them and building out short-term versus long-term models. And so that sort of segues us into Rosanna's talk and how an employer who may have foreign nationals currently in their staffing model, how they might be changing that or, need to change that, or if you're an employer who doesn't currently have foreign nationals, is it even possible to incorporate that aspect of diversity into your workforce? So Rosanna, is our employers still able to sponsor foreign workers?
That's a good question, Philomena. Before I get to that, I want to just preface and add to what you were saying. It's very difficult to take immigration out of the conversation about staffing models and people and culture and diversity and workforce. The reality is that while COVID certainly had a significant impact on a lot of industries, that impact is not uniform. Some businesses were impacted because they were forced to close. Other businesses were impacted because they are facing a shortage of qualified workers. So when I talk about immigration, when we talk with our clients, as you know, Philomena, about immigration and sponsorship, we're not talking about cheap labor or replacement of US workers. We're talking about filling a critical need that they may have within their business to jumpstart that growth or to fill in a skill gap or to diversify, because there's not different types of diversity. There's just, you're either diverse or you're not, right? And immigrants contribute to diversity in many ways that can really empower a business. So what we are seeing, some industries in the time of coronavirus pandemic are really struggling to fill open positions, partially because there is a skill gap for certain, highly specialized roles, but also because some businesses are actually experiencing unprecedented growth. Philomena, you mentioned PayPal earlier, and they're not our client or anything like that, but I think it's a good example. They were really highly utilized and successful in the past, even before the pandemic. But the pandemic, I think, took them to a different level. And I have a friend that works for a big telecom company. And so now that we're all on Zoom and we're all overutilizing GoToWebinar and all these technology tools, companies that provide these services are in dire need of extra set of hands. And these are really often highly specialized functions and roles that they need to fill. So what I'm getting at is certainly not saying that we don't have qualified US workers to fill these roles. What I'm getting at is that sometimes there's a shortage. There's just not enough because the need is so great. And so the ability to sponsor a foreign worker for a work visa to fill a need is actually an incredible recruiting tool. So, we work with 95% of our practice is employment-based immigration, which means we work primarily with companies and business people. And and we represent companies in the United States who, find themselves in a position where maybe they want to sponsor a foreign worker for a work visa. But what we hear from them is, they certainly don't go out and seek out immigrants to fill roles, right? They put out an ad and they recruit heavily to fill positions that are, really important for their organization. And only far into the process, they may realize that the candidate they've selected and are ready to commit to may be a visa holder. So that could be really intimidating for a company that has not in the past perhaps sponsored foreign workers, and they don't even know where to start. And there's also, with everything that's going on in the news, immigration obviously being very heavily politicized. It's a very sensitive topic of conversation. I'm sure all of us had, heated discussions one way or the other about immigration. But the reality is that there's a lot of confusion as to what's going on. Some news outlets report that immigration is dead in the water. We recently had, on June 22nd, another executive proclamation come down that effectively banned entry of foreign workers from abroad in heavily used visa categories like H-1B and L. I'm not going to get into the specifics of each of those visa categories, but I do want to clear up any confusion that it is still possible to sponsor visa holders. So if you are an employer who is recruiting and struggling to fill a position and you find a candidate who is a perfect fit and that person is in the United States, you really should seek and consult an immigration lawyer, because it's still possible to sponsor this worker for a work visa. Now, where do you start? Well, you contact an attorney, because there are more than one visa categories. There are a lot of regulatory compliance requirements that must be met. There is a misunderstanding, a big misconception that, immigrant labor is cheap labor, you get the skirt regulation. And perhaps there are people that take, employers that take advantage of that. Our clients that we work with are very compliance oriented, and there are a lot of protections that are built into many visa types, visa classifications, so that in fact, before an employer can hire an individual that requires a visa, they need to undergo a number of regulatory steps to ensure the protections for U.S. worker wages, various other labor-related protections. So, there's a lot of thought that goes into strategizing the correct approach. And also, we always tell our clients that, whenever you sponsor an employee for a temporary work visa, you'll always have to think ahead, because all temporary work visas are temporary. Eventually, they will need to be renewed, which is additional investment of time and resources. But also in the long term, if this employee becomes truly a part of your organization and is a huge contributor, a really strong performer, you need to, employers really need to think ahead and consider the ability to keep that employee on a more longer term basis. So there's definitely a lot of strategy, a lot of work that goes into this. And that's why, right away, I said that this is not an easy way to get cheap labor to replace, U.S. workers, but it is a really tremendous recruiting tool if you're struggling to find a good fit, or perhaps you're struggling because people are not comfortable coming back to work, right? Because of all the reasons that Philomena and Nancy discussed, safety concerns, et cetera. So this may be really a good way to fill that skill gap in your business. In terms of, how do you, let's say you have a candidate that you interview, and then you decide you want to proceed with that candidate, you want to hire them, and then it comes to your attention that they require visa sponsorship. You probably want to reach out to an immigration lawyer, at least for a consultation, to understand what your exposure is, understand what your investment would have to be. But if we take a step back, it's totally fine for an employer to ultimately make a decision not to sponsor foreign workers. There's no requirement that an employer has to make an offer and has to pay all these fees and follow all the regulations to sponsor a foreign worker visa. But what the employer cannot do is discriminate. And there are really strong protections that are built into the law that essentially tell employers what they can and cannot do in evaluating candidates for certain positions. And so this is a big part of workplace compliance that our firm handles, including I-9 compliance. But essentially, if you have, in your standard recruiting policies or processes, what an employer can ask routinely is whether or not a candidate presently requires sponsorship to work in the United States or will in the future require sponsorship to work in the US. That is basically as far as your inquiry can go. Anything beyond that could potentially land an employer in hot water, and they may be facing discriminatory practices. So that is a good way to sort of get initial sense of whether any particular candidate is someone who may require sponsorship. An employer cannot selectively implement these questions, and decide, well, this person looks this way, so I'm going to ask them, and then another candidate looks differently, so I'm going to pose this question. But it should be really built into their standard recruiting process, and that would also help the employer figure out whether or not they want to move forward with a candidacy. So, if you pose the question, do you presently require visa sponsorship in order to work in the United States? If the answer is yes, an employer can make the decision not to move forward with that candidate. Obviously, it has to be also a business decision. To just not move forward with the candidate because perhaps the employer is not interested in proceeding with visa sponsorship. Sometimes it's a financial decision. If it's a low-level position, let's say it's a position for which there's really no shortage in the employer's experience, there's really no shortage of qualified U.S. workers, and maybe perhaps it's an administrative assistant position. There may not be many visa options available, number one. And number two, an employer can make a business decision not to invest any additional funds towards sponsorship for that level position. As long as that decision is made on a neutral basis, then the employer is compliant. So, there are, as I mentioned, there are a lot of regulations surrounding immigration. It's a very complex field, but it's alive and kicking. And, given the trouble that we're facing now, trying to bring our businesses back to life, trying to grow our businesses, bring back our workforce, reconsider our core values, immigration, does contribute to diversity. It does contribute to that, it certainly builds your competitiveness as a company, right? I mean, that's a well accepted fact that immigrants, help us compete on the global market, on the global level, and it enriches the workforce. And so, just keep in mind, it's a really effective tool, and it's available.
Yeah, I think you raised a lot of really valid concerns, Rosanna, about the compliance and how, it's not something that employers actually take lightly at all. There's quite a bit of paperwork, and, now because of the way the market is, I think we're an employer to come across the resume of an individual who does require sponsorship. They may be intimidated, they may be, not sure about it. And it is very possible to sponsor. It's still happening. There are a lot of restrictions now. It's a more complicated playing field, but it's still happening. And so keep in mind that the workforce that is sponsored on a visa is really reliant on the employer to stay here. So if your staffing model, is such that you don't think you're going to need full-time help for the next year, or you're not sure, immigrants, people who are not from another country, that requires visa action. Like if you're going from full-time to part-time, if you are terminating and rehiring, this will all impact the visa status. So the takeaway, without getting into complicated matters, is that it's an area that requires action and attention constantly by the employer. And it is possible, but in times of high unemployment or uncertainty in staffing, it can be more difficult. But it is a strong tool that global companies, strong companies in this country utilize and will continue to utilize throughout this crisis. So with that said, I think we want to turn our attention to Michaela, who is going to talk about taking a holistic approach to diversity and inclusion and how employers can highlight that as part of their core values. So take it away, Michaela.
Thanks, Phil. I'd like to talk to you a bit today about that core value of diversity that I think it's pretty widely accepted both pre and post-COVID. Well, we're not really post-COVID yet, but during these unprecedented times that it's important to have diverse talent in your workforce. And just a little bit of background about myself. As Phil mentioned in the beginning, I'm of counsel at GT's New Jersey office in the Labor and Employment Group. I do employment litigation. I represent management side employers in agencies, state and federal, and also in court on matters primarily relating to employment discrimination, harassment, retaliation, those kinds of matters. But another important part of my practice is counseling employers on how to deal with their employees, sometimes on a day-to-day basis. It could be something like putting together trainings. That's something that we do often. And now we're getting a high demand for that because employers are faced with very unique issues that are very uncomfortable to talk about. And it's important that we not shy away from it. This is an opportunity, and that's just what I tell my clients all the time. It's an opportunity to lean into that discomfort and really talk about how you can support your employees in this crucial, crazy time with the pandemic and all of the other things that are going on. And more background about me, I mean, I'm not just a full-time employment lawyer and litigator. I'm a wife, I'm a mother of a rambunctious 19-month-old. And so trying to balance all of that, I've got some personal experience, as I'm sure many of you listening have experienced as well, trying to juggle full-time work and your family obligations and dealing with the very real impact of what you see in the news. We're all trying to figure out, and it's not just about core values, it's about really caring about your workforce. That's how you're going to not only attract qualified and dedicated workers, but you're going to keep them as well and really build your diversity numbers. And it's also not just about numbers. I mean, let's face it, COVID is hitting everybody. It's hitting everybody hard. And whether you may have heard that there are some portions of our communities, some groups who are disproportionately affected. We can't shy away from that fact. I say it's a fact because let's look at the CDC. They're tracking all of this, right?
Yeah.
Recently, they've got a report out that says as of June 12th, hospitalization rates are higher. They're increased, highest among non-Hispanic, American Indian, and Alaska Natives, and also non-Hispanic Black persons. And they acknowledge that this is in part due to social and economic injustices, disparities in the health system, etc. Now, while on an individual level, there could be any number of reasons why one person is heavily impacted by the disease, the fact remains that these groups are 4 to 5 times more likely to have adverse results from or impacts from COVID. If you look on the CDC's website, they do make some suggestions on how different stakeholders can actually help in bringing people together and getting them back to work and supporting them through all of this. It's a little further down on the website if you take a look, but it's important here because this is where employers can help and they can really step up. As Nancy mentioned, EAP programs, this is a benefit that many...
I want to just, I saw that, I read that part of the CDC website, and I thought it was really fascinating. Some of the suggestions were actually quite helpful in terms of engaging with communities of color and really engaging with the institutions like churches to assist people. And I thought that, you know, to kind of bring that into a business model would be an amazing thing that, looping back to Nancy and her talk and how to incentivize and to really show workers that you really care. And just, this is not just a stated core value, but here is us getting involved in the community. And I thought that it was really great that the CDC actually had those concrete suggestions on their website.
Yeah, it's really very helpful. And really, one of the things that I like to say about this whole process is, let's take the politics out of it. It's really about the people, and we need to focus on the people. COVID is something that we've never experienced before, nothing like it. And there are real impacts, particularly on mental health. And I think employers need to be mindful that it's not just that people are stressed out about the disease and how it's going to impact them individually, but there is also an overlay, so to speak. We all know in the news that in the wake of George Floyd's death, his tragic death, racial tensions have risen. People are talking more openly about how that has impacted them. And actually, I was doing some research on this and found something interesting. The National Center for Health Statistics, working in conjunction with the Census Bureau, has been monitoring how how mental health has been progressing during COVID and how it's been changing. So what they're tracking are reported I'm losing the word, but reported symptoms of anxiety and depression. Sorry. And what they do is they go over a look back period of 7 days. And this has been going on since, I believe, April 23rd. It's an experimental program where they're collecting data through surveys. And they take people reporting their symptoms of anxiety and depression, and they break out the data over various factors. They include age, they include gender, they include race, the state where they're located. It's really fascinating data that they're just collecting. No conclusions drawn yet, but there are some observations that I think are really important to keep in mind as employers think about how their employees are dealing with all that's going on and how they're actually going to be able to return to be productive in the workforce. The survey indicates that there is a higher frequency of anxiety and depression reported from younger age groups, and they have different brackets, but roughly speaking, from ages 18 to 49. I am sure that that encompasses a lot of your workforces. So that's something to think about. These people are experiencing increased levels of anxiety, understandably so. But then when we look at the other indices, we look at how it's affecting females versus males. Females are reporting much higher symptoms of anxiety and depression. That could be, again, for any number of reasons. But we're just going to take politics and everything out of it. It's just a human response to what's going on. Whatever caused it is really not the issue for the employer. It's what do you do with it when you know that there's an issue that is impacting your employees' mental health and their ability to be productive and contribute to the workforce, and just caring about them as a person. It may sound, kind of warm and fuzzy and mushy, and a lot of people don't like to talk about stuff like that, but it's important because now, as Nancy mentioned, people are making decisions about their employment based on personal items, personal issues, and whether or not the core values are lining up with their own. So that's something that you really need to think about. Another important and interesting note that I saw from the data is that the frequency of anxiety and depression symptoms that are reported over this 7-day look-back period since April 23rd appears to be higher around Blacks, for higher frequency for Blacks in particular, and also Hispanics. But when you look at the dates, you look at, I believe one of the reporting periods ended on May 26th. George Floyd's death was May 25th. Now, I'm sure that these numbers are going to be studied for months and years, but what jumped out at me was there was a spike in reported anxiety and depression symptoms for Blacks in particular, and also individuals of mixed race after that happened with George Floyd and everything that's happened since. Comparatively, what I found was interesting was non-Hispanic whites, while they do also report anxiety and depression symptoms, it was at a much lower rate and it kind of remained steady, although they too had an uptick after May 26th. Now, we don't know what the sources of the problems are. You can draw some, reasonable conclusions that perhaps the racial tensions in this country, which we see across the board, people are really looking to do something about it. Employers are looking to do something about it. And now employers are faced with difficult issues in the workplace where employees want to do things like wear Black Lives Matter masks. This is something that I've seen in hospital settings where they want to wear pins. You've seen the reports on Starbucks. This was widely reported that it was a huge issue, and how you deal with those situations is very tricky. You want to be supportive of your employees. You don't want to alienate anybody. However, you also have other considerations. If you, for the decisions that you're making, you really have to sit back and take that in and think about the long-term impacts and whether or not you're going to retain your workforce or create other problems flowing from your decisions. There's, like I said, there's a lot of things that are probably going to come from studies of these kinds of numbers once we do a postmortem of how COVID impacted everybody. But for now, I think a holistic approach to attracting and retaining diverse employees, and not just diverse employees, but employees in general. I like to think of a three-step approach. First, talk to your employees. It sounds simple, but it's really complicated actually at this time. The surveys that Nancy mentioned is a great idea. They can be anonymous, but it gives you a sense of what's important to the employees so they can tell you how they're doing, how they're feeling, what's bothering them. If you have a personal relationship with certain employees, you can reach out and talk to them and let them share with you what they want to share with you about how they're doing. You can ask the question, how are you feeling? How are you doing? How's your workload? Things like that. They might actually be more willing to tell you how they're feeling and how they're doing and how you can help. Another thing that you can think of doing is look at your, Nancy mentioned this as well, look at your benefits and whatever other resources that you may have within your organization to give additional support. Oftentimes you have all of the tools that really would be useful in a situation like this where people need, EAP, for example, but these things are tucked away and, your orientation packet buried in a handbook somewhere, posted on a bulletin board that nobody looks at unless they're at the vending machine, things like that just weren't at the forefront before, but now we have a unique opportunity to let employees know that these resources are available to you. They're not expensive for the employee. Oftentimes it's no cost. And it's something that at least you offering and showing that it's available and thinking of the employee's health and well-being shows them that you're invested in them, and that gives them an incentive to invest in your company and continue working hard. And you kind of open up that dialogue where everybody is better off. One other thing that we also like to talk about is specialized sensitivity training. What we see, unfortunately, there's a lot of tension that could be avoided in the workplace with some well-placed training. What we offer in my group, we've been doing this for a few years now, mostly focused on implicit bias with respect to gender, partially because there's been a lot of talk of that in the news and it's come to the forefront, but now race is right in the forefront too. And the same concepts apply both with respect to gender and race. You can institute some training to what I call blind spots, for lack of a better word. You can identify where, this seemingly neutral policy that you had or practice, usually it might come up in compensation decisions, promotion decisions. You will take a critical look at what your diversity numbers look like. Ask yourself, this takes a little bit of introspection. Ask yourself, well, what does my C-suite look like? Or what do my senior managers look like? Do they represent the population as a whole? Do I have any diverse employees at the most senior levels, because you got to think about it critically. If you were in a minority employee situation and they were one of, let's say, a handful, 5 out of 50, and all of the employees who have risen through the company don't look like them, there is actually a question that comes to some minorities' minds as to whether or not they actually have promotion opportunities. That's not to say that this is an intentional decision on the employer's part to not promote. It's a lot more complicated than that, and that's where we get into implicit bias. So we got to understand what implicit bias is in the first place, and many of you have probably already taken programs on this, but it's a bias that happens out of our conscious, and it's out of our awareness. It's not to be confused with intentional biases and stereotypes in the application of those in employment decisions. That still happens, and that's something that needs to be addressed. But I'm talking about something that's more subtle. These are like, think of them as like cognitive shortcuts that we use that your brain uses to make life easier, make quick decisions. Your brain fills in the blanks on things. Like, for example, if you are hosting a dinner party and you know that you want wine and cheese, and you go to the cheese section and the cheese is going to trigger you to, oh yeah, I need wine to go with this. That's kind of like one of the cognitive connections. You're not actively thinking about, I need to go get wine, but it's triggered by something else. That happens. We've seen it with respect to gender in our trainings that we give. There's one example that's very interesting that we've seen many implicit bias trainings cite this. So the DeWall study with the capuchin monkeys, and this is where you have 2 monkeys who are handing over a stone to the trainer, and their reward is a cucumber slice or a grape. Now, these capuchin monkeys prefer grapes. You have one monkey who is receiving for the same work, he's receiving cucumber slices. They look at the other monkey and they're like, hey, why are you getting grapes? I want the grapes. And the monkey gets frustrated, stops participating, withdraws from the whole, engagement with the trainer, doesn't want to do the work because they're not getting the same rewards that they see their counterpart getting. And that translates into you see that same phenomenon with respect to gender. A lot of women who have worked very hard in the workforce over many years, professional women and in others in blue collar fields, see the same type of thing. They're doing the same work as somebody who is in the in group, and they're not getting the same benefits. So why keep trying? They disengage. They can get angry. They can get apathetic. They're not going to give you the kind of production that you want, and they're not going to give you that kind of loyalty that you would hope that your workforce gives you. So especially at this time when employees are talking to each other about these issues, and they're verbalizing it more to management and gathering together and confronting managers about these types of issues, you got to think about, well, what is it that we're doing or not doing that we could be doing better? That's not to say that you are a sexist or you are a racist. I'm not here to talk about putting you in a box and attaching whatever IST you want to put on it. It's about looking critically at your behavior and how what you decide to do with that can change. Who are you giving those prime work assignments to, and why? Like, really think about it. I mean, you might just be giving work assignments to somebody who you think is available to do the work and would like to do the work. But sometimes it's a little deeper than that. Maybe the person who didn't get the work just had a baby, and you think that they really would rather spend more time with their family. You're actually might be trying to help that person, but it's not helpful to the person who needs to get prime work assignments in order to excel through the company. These are the types of things.
I see that happen a lot. That happens a lot.
Yeah, these are
with parents sometimes missing opportunities because the company thinks they're supporting them, but actually removing them from an opportunity.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's totally fine. And I'm glad you're validating what I've seen as well. What I've also seen with respect to minorities, and a lot of times folks don't think about this, there's if your company is sponsoring an event, and let's say it has to do with something relating to equality with respect to race, and celebrating diversity, what I have seen, I've seen some complaints come through from employees. Well, I don't really want to go, and these are diverse employees. Well, I don't really want to go to all of these diversity functions. I want to go to these business development functions, and I don't ever get that opportunity. And why is that? Now, the employer could very well be saying, well, I think this would make this individual comfortable. It's a good opportunity for them, gives them exposure. But that's not necessarily how it comes across to the employee. So it's sometimes thinking about that. You may think you're being helpful by making these associations, but again, it comes back to communications with your employees. These conversations can come in the context. I don't recommend doing them in like performance evaluations. There's a lot of pressure there, but you can have more informal discussions. Well, where do you see yourself going? What are your interests? What would you like to do? Go ahead and offer them certain opportunities that you maybe in the back of your mind you don't think they'd accept, and let them reject it. At least you've given the opportunity, and then you can have that ongoing dialogue, and they feel valued. And you might be surprised that they're the best person for that job that you thought, well, maybe for insert whatever reason you thought maybe they wouldn't be the best person, or maybe they wouldn't like it. You might find that that is the best decision for everybody all around. Now, I think there's one other example that I wanted to provide. It's a recent example, just anecdotal. We all know that Juneteenth holiday just passed.
I was just going to ask you about that. I wanted to make sure that you mentioned that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
it slipped for a minute, but Juneteenth holiday just passed, and as we know, I'm sure you've seen a lot of employers are starting to recognize that holiday. And while some individuals may not have been familiar with what Juneteenth is, I can assure you that a lot of Black employees absolutely knew what it was and were very ecstatic to have that recognition. It's not about the day off, it's about the recognition that this holiday is very, very important. So what I'd like to share is just something that I heard from one of my friends, and it surprised me. I kind of heard this story over and over and over again. With a manager who simply wanted to say, hey, we have this holiday, it's a new holiday. The message was supposed to be go enjoy the holiday, celebrate, have a good day off. Simple enough. But this manager, in trying to deliver that message, added a slightly insulting and almost dismissive but a phrase. This holiday is to commemorate all that's going on in the world today. That's no malice intended, no ill will, it wasn't coming from a place of I don't appreciate Black people or their history. It wasn't consciously coming from that place, but that is exactly how it was perceived when it was delivered to the employees who actually knew what the holiday was about, and they were offended. Now, in this climate, I think in the past, maybe employees would have been less likely to speak up about a manager saying something, misspeaking about what the holiday was about. But what happened in that particular scenario was that the employee and manager had a dialogue. It was tense, it was uncomfortable, but what this manager decided to do was embrace it, go do some research, came back, thanked the employee for educating him about what Juneteenth was all about. And the employee, in turn, my friend, was like, I wasn't expecting that. I thought this was just going to be another thing that was just brushed off, and that it was dismissive of an important celebration, commemoration, something that's important culturally to me. And I felt like it was just going to be another, thing that is just brushed off as my bad, I didn't mean it. But he was pleasantly surprised when the manager turned around and took that in and said, thank you. I didn't know, and I'll do better next time. And everybody's better for it. But there's some legal implications here, potentially. that same type scenario actually happened in multiple locations of this employer, different locations throughout the country. And they were, they didn't have great diversity numbers, but the few Black employees who heard similar messages from their white managers heard it the same way. Was dismissive of a very culturally significant event for Black people, and some people felt that it was actually due to race, that it was actually intended to be demeaning. And some of the managers in the other locations didn't really respond in the same way as my close friend's manager. And the result is potentially, a banding together of employees because they're all talking about this stuff, and, claims of potential racial bias. And then they start pointing to other incidents that happened in the past and string them all together. And you can get a narrative that while the company was well-meaning and in recognizing this holiday, but what ultimately happened was the message didn't get down to frontline managers that this is something that you need to understand, why we're doing this, why it's a core value, why this is important, and this is the type of message that you need to be delivering to your employees. It wasn't consciously from a place of discrimination and bias, but the effect was the same. And so these are the kinds of things that a lot of employers are facing day to day, especially now with COVID and with the racial tensions that are in the country today. And when you layer all of that on top of the already high stress that your employees are under, it's like a powder keg waiting to explode. And employers are grappling with how to manage that. But actually leaning into the conversation rather than shying away from it is making, at least in my experience, employers having a much better time with managing people coming back into the workforce and staying rather than leaving.
Thank you so much, Michaela. I mean, I think that is such a valuable piece of information for employers to take away from this, is leaning into it. I think that I can imagine scenarios where employers would be afraid to talk about it and to say the wrong thing, even if, the intentions are good. And so I want to highlight that you mentioned sensitivity training, and now might be a great time to invest in something like that, because it's important to try our best to get it right. And
we're actually revamping our implicit bias training that previously focused on gender, but it's fascinating to see how all of these things interplay, and we're revamping that program coming soon with my team back at GT on racial implicit bias and how that presents in the workplace and what to do about it.
Thank you. I think we have one question if we have time. We have a couple of minutes left. I saw a question come through. Hi, Vinny, did you want to read that, or okay?
Sure. So the question is, what types of special programs can employers offer employees to improve workplace culture?
Okay. So Nancy, did you want to just quickly comment on special programs? Or
I think that's such a broad question in my mind, because culture, what culture means is, how we do things here, right? Basically, I always say it's like how we do things around here. That's what culture means at a company. And so there's plenty of ways to improve culture. I think starting with any of the things we discussed today, as far as hearing your employees, taking the extra time to speak to them, to hear from them, to know their point of view, to know how they feel on a lot of these topics. Programming wise, I think, yes, bringing in someone like Michaela is a great example of a program that would improve culture anywhere, I think. Sensitivity training, conflict resolution training, finding more opportunities for your employees also to cross-functionally and cross-departmentally know each other and work together. If you're an organization that has a large, maybe, you have a large corporate office, but you also have a warehouse, right, with warehouse employees. How often are those warehouse employees getting to meet the office people, and vice versa? Because they're both going to feel so much better about their collaboration, their day-to-day, once everyone is a human and people that they can connect. So I think any opportunity to bring people together and working with, new areas and new folks is a great idea.
Yeah. And I also, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I would imagine, if you're able to be flexible on work location, if you're able to
Absolutely.
have it incentivize, people to maybe offer a bonus for childcare or any type of childcare related program, now is the time to get crafty.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
For
And
sure.
I was one other resource that I forgot to mention earlier, for increasing your benefits, would be if let's say you're a very small company and maybe your benefits are not the greatest because you're just 10 employees or something, I would consider for next year or for open enrollment looking into a PEO, which is a professional employer organization. Oof, like JustWorks, for example, where you can join hundreds of other 10-person companies and get much better rates on your health insurance and benefit programs and things like that. So it's a great way for you to plug into a larger community of small businesses and be able to leverage that size together.
Great. Well, I think that concludes. I think we're out of time. Thank you again, Vinny. Thank you, NJBIA, and thank you to the panelists. I think, we all learned a lot today, and I really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.
So to our audience,
for
don't
having
forget, all of you will be receiving a recording of today's webinar via email within the next 24 hours. When you close out of the webinar, a survey will come up on your screen that we hope you'll fill out so we can understand how to best provide you important information in a webinar format. Our next webinar, Path and New Jersey Transit Guidance for Commuters During COVID-19, will take place tomorrow at 11, so by all means, feel free to register for that one on our website at njbia.org/webinars. And by all means, check out Domain Computer Services for all your IT needs at go-domain.com. So for our panel, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye.